Good morning, everyone. I am Josephita, and please help me welcome Amar Singh as our first speaker today.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. The topic which was given to us to present here was the changing dynamics in the Asian markets. But before that, I would like to introduce MRAI, since I can see many new faces which have not worked with MRAI in past or are not the members of MRAI. MRAI stands for Materials Recycling Association of India. We are having 1,800 members from all over the world, mostly Indian companies and many foreign companies as well. MRAI main work is to liaison a lot with the government. We have dedicatedly put a licensing desk or an office, you can say, in the capital of the country, which is Delhi. A team of 8 to 10 people are working there just for licensing every day. In the audience, we have our President, Mr. Sanjay Mehta, and our Vice President, Mr. Zain Nathani, and few more directors will be joining us. The biggest strength of MRAI is its directorship. We have 25 directors who are the biggest companies, who represent the biggest companies in the country. Most of them are listed on stock exchange and are doing tremendously well. So this is one of the reasons that the policies, we come to know well in advance that what are the policies we are going to face, challenges in future. And likewise, we liaison a lot with the government. But coming to my presentation, today's presentation is how India is going to grow in next 5 years and how the demand of scrap is going to be there. As you can see on the screen, by 2030 FY30, the projection is 255 million metric ton for ferrous scrap. This projection came 10 years back, and at that time, around 2020, at that time India was producing 100 million metric ton. I was like amazed at that time, how come we can just increase 1.5 times more? But now, standing today, we are producing 152 million metric tons per year. Non-ferrous for critical metals like aluminum, copper, lots of rapid electrolysis acceleration fueled by power grids, electrification, and EVs. The non-ferrous sector is bound to increase by 12% CAGR. And for papers, the rapid e-commerce boom and increase in packaging industry demand, the current 17.7 million metric ton is estimated to grow by 21.5 million metric ton by FY30. The ferrous production is scaling up, which I think I've already covered. And half of it is met through primary source and half of it is met through secondary source, which is scrap, billets. I will skip this slide. The consumption of steel products as on date is mostly into around 68% is into construction sector, around 8 to 9% in automobile, and around 16% into engineering products and other appliances, but this is going to change. By 2030, the construction and infrastructure sector, the 68% will drop down to 60%. There you will see more increase in automobile industries, the use of ferrous scrap or steel products, and more use in engineering and packaging products likewise. The construction and infrastructure demand will be increasing. I was going through a site called Invest India. What are the reasons one should invest in India? One of the biggest motivating factor is our per capita consumption is increasing day by day. Our per capita consumption for ferrous was significantly low, around, I think, 110 or 120 kgs, which is growing tremendously year-on-year basis. There are various other factors. One of the most important factors is government is allocating huge budgets on infrastructure and construction. I don't know how many of you have visited India like 10 years back. Any idea? Anyone has visited to Mumbai like 10 years back? Yeah. So, Mark, just to tell you, from Mumbai airport till Taj Mahal Palace, initially it used to take 2.5 hours. Now you can reach there in exactly 40 minutes. So this kind of infrastructure changes is happening in every nooks and corners of the country. So this is one of the main reasons that we see the demand for ferrous scrap will be there a lot. Automotive sector. If you see in FY25, two-wheeler sales was around 23.8 million metric ton, 8 millions. Four-wheelers sales were around 6.1 million. And this is going to increase at a CAGR of 9.6% from $124 billion industry to $196 billion industry. And the biggest thing is the adoption of EV will play the crucial role. And as you all know, if the EV will be adopted more and more, we will find more and more recyclables in the business. These are some bottlenecks which we are facing on day-to-day basis when we talk about Indian recycling industry. The biggest challenge is we are highly dependent upon import of scrap. Ferrous, it is around 15 to 20%, but in non-ferrous, it is around 80 to 90%. One of the reasons is we have not been a huge consumption country, but slowly and steadily our consumptions are increasing. As I said, that the per capita income is increasing day by day. There is existence of informal sector, business, and environmental pressure are the few bottlenecks. And strategies going ahead will be like focusing more on formal sector, reducing the GST and all. So we'll take it ahead. This is a very important slide. As on today, aluminium, the domestic demand of the aluminium is around 4.9 million metric ton. Copper is around 1.9 million metric ton. Lead is around 1.4 million metric ton. And zinc is around 1.1 million metric ton. But see, after 2030, the projections are very, very strong. The aluminium will be around 8.5 million metric ton, which is almost double from here. Copper will be around 3.3 million metric tons. Your lead will be around, copper will be around 3.3, lead will be around 2.5, and zinc will be around 2 million metric ton, which is just double from here. It will be growing at a CAGR of 12%. And these are, I can 100% tell you, these are just numbers once we will be talking in 2030, you will see us surpassing all these numbers. As I told, that there is huge demand surge, massive growth projections from automobile industry to infrastructure industry to electric goods industry. Everywhere we are seeing huge demand. So coupled with AI data centers, and India is one of the most favored nation when it comes to data center and AI revolution. Various countries are planning to invest a lot in India for data centers and AI revolution. The modern urban infrastructure grid, if you see, it will tell you that the power, construction, transport, EV, consumer durables, these are the main source of growth in demand in the country. And with this, the demand for scrap will be more and more going ahead in the country. This is about paper. As I mentioned initially, that due to e-commerce and packaging industry, a lot of paper scrap will be needed in the country. These are few challenges which I have already mentioned. I would like to thank you all for patiently listening. If you have any questions, we can take them in last. Just a small, like you all know, MRI do regular conferences like ReMA. This year we did a very big conference in Jaipur, which was attended by 3,000 delegates. And this year, in August 31st and 1st of September, we are doing our fourth international business summit in Japan, Tokyo. I request, please do come and attend that conference as a delegate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you, Amar. Our next presentation will be by Zulma from Kallanish.
Well, good morning, everyone. She did a great job of presenting one of the mammoths, which is India. I will focus on other regions in Asia. So the title is Asia Ferrous, the road to green steel, trade shifts, and the supply gaps that we're facing. I'll go over the global drivers, Asia in perspective when it comes to metals itself, and specifically ferrous. And I'll cover a little bit of the Asia paper markets and some highlights in regards to U.S. as well exports. So the global drivers, I know you've in many presentations you've had the opportunity to hear this, but the rising demand for the recycled ferrous. We have carbon policy, green steel commitments that are expanding EAF investments. We also have induction investments in Asia. Scrap steel requires up to 70% less energy versus primary iron making. And the environmental, social, and governance issues, which is the ESG, the mandates that are having some of the large corporations reinforcing recycling and the circular materials. Now, trading in Asia. So Asia is the world's largest net importer of ferrous. So it's between 60 and 65 million tons annually. There's a high EAF growth expected through at the present moment active. There has been some closures as well through 2030 and 2050. Many of the corporations are setting those benchmarks on a carbon basis. And as I've noted, induction furnaces that are growing. They have faced market volatility. So a critical trend is to diversify away from single market dependency, both from the buying source and the selling source. The supply flow shifts are increasingly shaped by protectionism, geopolitics, freight, Of course, always the factor of price and what the margin possibilities are. As I did a survey on, with some contacts on elements to mention when it comes to trading and in Asia, was understands the specs by country. Essential. When it comes to knowing the codes, understanding the specs. Investing quality controls to minimize contamination. We all know what happened in 2018, later in 2021. When it came to China, the changes in contamination and the requirements and the specs being, more and more stringent, and how costly it can be by not meeting those standards when trying to enter those markets. The claims experience, both on the buyer and the seller. Doing a survey, why are some individuals selecting to not engage in exports? It's some of their experience when it comes to claims, developing those business relationships. And of course, from the buying source as well, is understanding what the spec was. And, once again, that trust factor and relationships always, that was, one of the survey results. One comment, which is, I'm going to defray for paper, is the paper mills in Asia drive global recovered fiber demand. So I'll make a couple of comments when it comes to where the paper market is going and some of the pulse items that are happening at the present moment. Key trade flow shifts. Things are changing. We of course know about the war situation, the freight, some of the challenges we have when it comes to fuel prices. So usual net exporters are exporting less. There's tightening of global availability. When we look at the numbers, U.S. scrap exports to Asia have declined. Japan is retaining, especially over the next few years, will retain more scrap internally, leading to a shrinkage in export surplus. Australia, there are several, 4 or 5 EAFs that will be coming on board in the next 1-2 years, depending on the economics. There may be a slight delay. Australia will not be exporting as much, and it's a source. And then finally, we have the EU waste shipment regulations that are going to come into effect in May 2027. So the buyers will need to meet certain requirements in order to be able to import. So it's something that needs to be planned for. Regional players establishing core relationships or ownership for raw materials in other countries also, such as Japan and the U.S. So there are South Korean mills that have made investments in Japan. So they are going to garner that volume that will no longer be available to the export market, or to the extent that it's exported, it's to them. In the U.S., we see companies like the ones in Peru, a mill in Peru, investing in Florida. We see different acquisitions, different mergers. So there is the desire to have some of that vertical assurance of the ferrous material. There's increasing tonnage coming from EU, UK, and Australia at the moment. But as mentioned, that will be changing over the next couple of years. So more countries in Asia are looking at their domestic. Now, India and China have a very formalized plan and are looking at that formalized plan when it comes to the next 5 years, the next 10 years. How are we going to have resource assurance? But not all countries are thinking as thoroughly. There is definitely that on a regulatory basis. But there needs to be, there's going to be more activity happening at how can they secure that resource in the domestic market. Now we have container freight rates remain a dominant price driver in trade. Ferrous depends very much on what is happening in freight, how things are going to be mobile. The location, whether it's from the West Coast, from the East Coast in the U.S. And what we've noticed is more and more as I speak with sources in Asia, they are sourcing in Latin America. They are looking at other options. Now, countries like Pakistan, were buying or, have activity in the Middle East. And at the moment, it's affected. So, also there were purchases from India, when it comes to DRI. you're going the reverse redirection. So those are things that are affecting. Now, for how long? I mean, that's a conversation I know we've all had. For how long is this uncertainty? But one thing that I really took from yesterday's presentation by the gentleman, kind of looking forward on the outlook, is that we can't say it was a surprise. We've been seeing the changes. We've been seeing the shifts. So how do we plan for them? So logistical risk through the Strait of Hormuz, reducing access from usual sources, is actively happening. How long that planning needs to happen, of course, it depends on the forecast of what we believe will happen in the geopolitics. And the Middle East freight risk premiums that we're finding throughout all metals, especially in ferrous. So South Asia specifically. So of course, India, we have EAFs growing, IF, in the induction furnaces. And that's an opportunity for ferrous, actually, because the quality that needs to, the high quality of scrap necessary will, carry on its demand. Bangladesh, top importer, processes 12 to 15 million tons of shipped scrap a year, is diversifying its sources, has a gas shortage. So that will also determine the production and the scale. Pakistan and Bangladesh also letters of credit. I don't think I need to let you know. We've all spoken about letters of credit and when it comes to the FX limitations, the foreign exchange limitations. Strong mill appetite, also a gas shortage risk. Energy costs are definitely something they're contending with, and the sourcing from the UAE to the extent that there's been disruptions at the moment. Domestically, the construction infrastructure spending will be key anchors for each of those economies. And we already alluded to the economies in India, but all of them are developing countries. They'll also be producing more ferrous, and legislatively will be trying to grow, as well as the business opportunity domestically. The freight volatility from Middle East tensions is impacting flows and pricing, as we've noted. Now, Bangladesh imports. Here we can see shredded, and we can see the increase in the last several weeks or the last month. It's affected their ability to purchase, and we see inflationary aspects in all ways. Also, the U.S. market has protectionism. So when it comes to the domestic seller evaluating, do I sell to export or do I keep it in the domestic market? The domestic market is strong and it is favored. East Asia. So Japan, reducing exports as domestic scrap use climbs for decarbonization, as mentioned. South Korea, strong importer, reduced steel production capacity, though, at the moment. We haven't seen that much bulk being purchased as historically. So the domestic scrap flows are rising as well. So when I speak with market participants, they're saying, hey, we're favoring that domestic volume. Taiwan, active in containerized markets, also seasonal shifts. We have energy decisions that affect capacity, especially during the hot summer. Then freight tightness plus reduced U.S. flows elevating import costs for the various entities or the various countries. Japan's exports. That's what we're seeing from a pricing mechanism. And we definitely saw an increase. There is globally scrap tightness. There's expectations when it comes to the U.S. market, of a flat market. And what does that mean when it comes to the export potential? Japanese scrap trade. This is something to see. So we see Vietnam increasing, Bangladesh as well. So they are sourcing. They're shifting a little bit of their sourcing regionally. Korea, there's been a decline. Indonesia. And interestingly enough, Indonesia and Singapore both have contracted some of their EAF capacity, recently. So in the short term, within the region, we expect a little bit more of trading within them, for scrap, but they won't last. Taiwan. And, of course, for that region, for Japanese scrap, about 7.7 million last year. So Southeast Asia, did I come? Okay. So Vietnam, fastest growing importer, the 11 million tons. Rebar and construction steel dominate the production. Malaysia, rapid growth in induction furnace capacity. Smaller mills are increasing scrap demand. So we see growth. It definitely will, of course, depend once again on the global economy. We saw World Steel saying about 0.3% increase, in 2026, 2.7% increase in steel production in, 2027. So there's, a clear government incentive promoting EAF-based industrial production, carbon neutrality, the roadmap. Thailand, EAF developments, more mature, growth is steady, focusing on improving domestic scrap collection rather than new furnace capacity. Then we have Indonesia, growing steel capacity to, 10 million tons annually by 2027. So one thing that is definitely of note is the quality of the scrap. And scrap quality requirements are increasing as mills upgrade operations, as they also specialized. China, the mammoth. So the giant is recalibrating. The policy shifts. There's restricted scrap imports, the permit system that we all know about that really affected. But from what we hear is there's discussions on changing some of the specs for shredded. Opportunity to import HMS, some of that under development, when it comes to the definition, but that'll be an opportunity. People always ask the question, will China be a net exporter? We don't see it in the next 20 years. They will consume, there'll be a balance. They have enough need in order to, achieve their carbon objectives. So we anticipate for them to keep it locally, but also an opportunity for import. Relatively small though compared to the mammoth that it is. Government work report, reduced carbon intensity by 3.8% in 2026. Domestic scrap production is near 227 million tons annually and increasing. They're aiming for 300 million, by 2030. High-grade material still imported and at a premium. So to the extent that a material is imported, there's a premium. There is a payment on that as well. So there's that evaluation on price. High-grade material, my apologies. Imports a low amount, relatively speaking, but Beijing announced the metal scrap import rules that I just mentioned. We don't expect them to be a net exporter, and they're phasing out inefficient capacities. So there'll be more and more support for EAF steelmaking to the extent that they want to satisfy the specs for responsible steel or any of those specifications to be defined as green steel, especially now that EU has established their carbon pricing. And if any of you saw some of that pricing, it's relatively drastic and dramatic per ton. So more and more scrap will be a defining factor. Australian scrap trade. So we have, some of the highlights. India, interestingly enough, has purchased less from Australia. Bangladesh, around flat, relatively speaking. Indonesia, growth. And annually, though, about a 2.3 million kept at 1% change. So we haven't seen that much. U.S. scrap trade to Asia. So that specific number was 5.6 million, and we saw a decline annually. Asia in perspective when we look at the future. So looking at different forecasters, looking at, different models that are there. The scrap demand we anticipate is South Asia to be between 75 and 85 million. East Asia, 360 to 385. Southeast Asia, 30 to 33 for a total. And then there's the optimistic and, generally speaking for the 2050 outlook. One of the comments that, one of the stars is when it comes to China, there will be an aging population, so they expect slight contraction going into that period. Couple of minutes on paper. So Kallanish does not, my apologies, Kallanish does not cover paper itself. So I had a conversation with Johnny Gold, who's the founder of Gold, the group Recycling Consulting, and Miles Cohen. And unfortunately, neither of them were able to make it to this presentation. One flew out this morning. So when it comes to the Asia's paper market, the China's waste import ban, once again mentioned, 2018 and in 2021, reshaped the regional flows. Southeast Asian mills became major recovered fiber importers. And China was backing off it has announced that it is backing off imported brown fiber pulp. So basically the material was being taken to Southeast Asia, the pulp produced, and then imported into China. And over the course of the last few months, we've heard more of that backing from the brown fiber pulp volumes. Unlike metals, it cannot be stored indefinitely. So it has a very different dynamic. Demand supported by e-commerce, packaging growth, but also affected now with right sizing. So one of the comments that Miles made yesterday as we were conversing is, it is structural. One of the comments he made is, I have never had a consultant tell me how can I make things the way I used to make them. It's always how do we make them right size? How do we make them thinner? How do we extend? So this is a very structural change that we're not going to see a large potential growth in this when it comes to packaging. Then it depends on the success of the consuming product. So one example that I was given was in India. There was a ceramic company that was sourcing certain type of fiber and certain type of paper in order to protect its goods. Well, unfortunately, when that ceramic company did not succeed, they went broke, that flow of material stopped. So it's very dependent on the success of the consuming products. So that's definitely a plan for the paper mills. Freight sensitive transportation, port charges and surcharges are it's very sensitive to that market. And paper right now, business conditions in Asia, the summary of my conversation was they're not great. And much depends on China itself. So the dependency is there on their economy. Another quote that I got was, strong economies are going to need corrugated, but that strength needs to be achieved. And there's relatively different questions on how much of a growth and strength in the economies are we going to see in the next 1 to 5 years. Once again, highlights from this. In the U.S. Northeast and Midwest, we had weather disrupted collections. So we had some price mechanisms that supported. U.S. export volumes are at 13.7 million short tons. They were up 3% from 3.3 in 2024 and down 7% from 2023. But the U.S. previously shipped 20 million tons in 2017. So in 7 years, it has declined 33.5%. Now, the U.S. has closed many paper mills in the course of the last 2 years. The headlines has also opened much more technologically advanced units, but they are not consuming all the material that is being produced in the domestic market. So the top 4 export destinations, India, Thailand, Mexico, and Malaysia at the moment. The U.S. shipping to Canada and Mexico. So there's a growth in regional trade. And the U.S. is consuming some of the material domestically, as I said, because through their modern mills in the past few years. Closed a large number of mills due to high operating costs. So everything has a lot of the questions have to do with how efficient can we be in the paper world. And the depressed prices, in the U.S., see weekly export prices are up. We noticed about $10 to $15 in Q1, but they also dropped between $25 and $30 in the last half of the previous year. So the factors are economy for demand, quality to specs, and shipping. But there will be a lot of operational planning when it comes to those that are involved in paper. And thank you.
Thank you, Zulma. We started with India. We went all the way to Australia and back here to Stan Chen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to ReMA. This has been an absolute fantastic convention this year. I do want to thank Josephita for inviting me to the panel. My Stan Chen. I'm from United Metal Recycling. I'm a second-generation recycler, and for me, this topic is actually both professional and personal. My father started off our business in the mid-1970s, and we were among the early recyclers that went into China in the when they opened up their markets in the late 1980s. So I've actually had the opportunity to watch over the decades how Asia has become the center of gravity for global metals demand. What I want to share today is that Asia still matters enormously, but the market is no longer explained by one country, one growth engine, or one trade quote. Today, it's being shaped by shifting demand, tighter regulation, geopolitics, energy prices, freight disruption, and tariffs. So the main message of this presentation is simply that basically demand still matters, but policy and logistics now decide who can actually move material. For a long time, many exporters could think about Asia primarily through a China lens. If China was among basically strong, the region was strong. That playbook no longer holds, right? Today, Asia still drives incremental demand, but the engine that has to be read as China plus India plus ASEAN, right? Not China alone. Regulatory changes can redirect scrap and recycled material flows almost as quickly as underlying demand. Energy, freight, sanctions, and tariffs can reprice markets faster than most sellers can adjust. And there's also obviously the domestic U.S. angle that basically that matters for recyclers. Especially right now with trade tariffs, they raise the landed cost of imported metal and support domestic finished prices. So U.S. mills often gain more room by bidding aggressively for scrap. So exporters are not just competing with buyers overseas, they're also competing with the domestic markets whose pricing power may be strengthened by trade policy. So the right way to think about Asia right now is not that China is over, but that it's actually, it's Asia's leadership is broadening. China is slowing, but not collapsing. And that means it still matters enormously for regional industrial demand, but still influences pricing. The strongest incremental growth story, however, is increasingly coming from India, obviously, we see that, and to a lesser degree from parts of Southeast Asia. Why does that matter to exporters? Well, because we're moving from a giant destination story to several smaller, faster growing, more policy sensitive markets. All right. That creates opportunity, but it also means, basically, exporters need to be much more selective. It's no longer enough to say Asia is up. You have to know which country, which metal, which buyer, and under what rules. So I want to talk about China a little bit because basically, we had a yard, obviously, in terms of macroeconomic shifts. The big thing, obviously, was the buildup into the Beijing Olympics from what I saw growing up, basically 26 years in the industry at this point, starting in 2000, going in and seeing basically that buildup of infrastructure and 2008 Olympics, what I consider China's coming out moment, right? It's how China announced itself to the world. And in the buildup to that, it was really giving a demand signal. So China still sets the floor and ceiling for many metals markets because it remains the biggest producer, consumer, and exporter in the region. Even with slower growth, China is simply too large to ignore. But the important point is China is no longer the old structural supercycle story built on real estate and relentless infrastructure expansion. Real estate actually remains the drag. They overbuilt. Right? That matters especially for the ferrous market, steel margins, and related scrap demand. What is cushioning China is infrastructure, manufacturing, export activity, and industrial policy support. So for recyclers, China matters less today as the only growth engine and more as the marginal price setter. All right. If China changes import posture, export posture, or industrial policy, the whole market feels it. So what I would watch is property sales, local government capex, PMI, export orders, and any shift in trade or import policy, not just headline GDP from China. So this is where I want to connect the current China story to something I lived through personally. All right. Again, I watched China building into the Beijing Olympics. The demand signal was visible in construction, infrastructure, and mega projects. That was a bulk commodity and steel intensive story, and it created a very powerful pull for scrap. Today, look, with the new administration, with 2025, all these trade tariffs, China still sends a demand signal. It's a different kind of signal. All right. It's less about property and bulk construction, and it's more about export-led manufacturing and industrial policy. China has actually, at this point, obviously, we know China is the world's largest manufacturer of EV vehicles. It's not coming to the U.S. It's going to everywhere else in the world, right? When you go to Latin and South America, you see Chinese EVs. When you go to Africa, it's all Chinese EVs. Basically, all of their products are still going to essentially all other parts of the world except for the U.S. All right. In the near term, China can export more aluminum and aluminum products. I actually do want to talk about aluminum because basically what's going on is, especially with the aluminum is a very energy intensive industry. And, so they're actually going to be capitalizing on the increase, aluminum prices because they actually have a lot of stock to export right now with elevated prices. All right. So domestic demand stays soft and global prices remain attractive. Look, it's Chinese buyers are moving from hand to mouth purchasing. Inventories were rising and overseas sales of unwrought aluminum products are already surging into early 2026. And they're going to be surging basically now that we have elevated prices with kind of a slowdown in the U.S.-Iran conflict. Longer term, I actually do want to point this out. China is actually trying to differentiate itself in a more saturated market with green aluminum. So this is for not just I'm going to be addressing just not only American exporters, but basically where the materials are going to the export markets. And I will say basically address Indian markets in general, because basically you're competing against China. China in a saturated market is going to try to differentiate itself in terms of building through green aluminum, recycled aluminum, EVs, batteries, chips, machinery, shipbuilding, lower carbon industrial positioning. So the China demand signal is still real, but today it's more supportive of copper, aluminum, flat steel, electric equipment and fabrication than a broad ferrous, basically scrap super cycle. So if China is still the price setter, then India is obviously the clearest incremental growth story. And we know this, right? India remains the fastest growing major steel and industrial market in Asia. It's benefiting from public capex, urbanization, manufacturing build-out, and a broader effort to expand domestic industrial capacity. For recyclers, that makes India one of the most important markets to watch. At the same time, ASEAN matters because basically supply chains are fragmenting into the region. And this is actually an offshoot of 2018 with the Green Sword policy, right? What happened with all of the scrappers, all the manufacturing capacity and everything at that point? Essentially for all of my guys, well, you know what? I can't send scrap into China anymore. Guess what? They went into all of the satellite nations around to process the materials because guess what? China still needs commodities. It still needs raw materials. It just couldn't handle the contaminated raw materials. So basically, all the manufacturing capacity has shifted to satellite countries. With trade tariffs, this is the same, basically, it's the same playbook. All right. So ASEAN matters because supply chains are fragmenting. Manufacturing relocation, autos, electronics, infrastructure all support demand, but ASEAN is not one market. The rules, quality expectations, customs environment, enforcement culture differ sharply by country. How, look, Malaysia, we all know if we're sending stuff to Malaysia, look, it's a pretty tight regulatory environment, right? So the message here is, yes, opportunity is real, but execution matters. Exporters need market selection, local compliance, and trusted counterparties, not just bullish macro assumptions. So I actually want to talk about the U.S.-Iran conflict, right? Because basically, how does that flow into materials, demand, scrap market outlooks? It's really interesting what happened, right? When the Strait of Hormuz was shut down, right? This is actually what we're seeing. Energy is no longer a background variable. It is a front and center metals variable. Asia's manufacturing economy has benefited in some cases from lower cost or discounted feedstocks, especially, let's face it, when we're talking about Chinese manufacturing. So what we're finding out is basically Russian and Iranian barrels have influenced refining economics in countries like India and China, right? So basically you're able to take those barrels of oils at a steep discount, essentially lowering your manufacturing costs. This obviously with the Strait of Hormuz disruption, these lower income, it's right now lower input costs support manufacturing, refining, and metals intensity, but that advantage is not permanent as we're seeing right now. Okay, if crude discounts narrow, sanctions tighten, which we're doing right now, shipping and insurance costs jump, Asia's industrial cost base can reprice very quickly, and this is happening as we speak. Exporters feel that first in slower orders, wider spreads, tougher negotiations, and greater payment risk. On the U.S. side, right, tariffs can create another form of repricing. Imported steel, aluminum, and copper become more expensive as they are now. Domestic finished prices and premiums can stay firmer than they otherwise would, and that improves the economics for domestic consumers of scrap, especially mills, right? And essentially that pulls the materials back to the U.S. markets before it ever reaches the export channels. So want to go into basically the economics, essentially at what point, I put this slide in is to illustrate basically at what point does an increased metals market or increased price start causing essentially demand destruction, right? This is the question a lot of people are asking right now. At what point does a higher oil stop helping aluminum through supply stress and start hurting it through demand destruction? Right now, we have essentially a market disruption in terms of both of the EAFs in the UAE have been taken out by Iranian drone attacks, and that I believe was 7% of global production of aluminum of the primary, right? So this happened in stages in terms of demand destruction. Aluminum is unusual because it rallies first on energy and supply disruption, just because the energy cost is so high, right? If the Gulf supply is constrained, shipping is disrupted, and power costs rise, aluminum can move higher even while demand is starting to weaken underneath. What usually cracks first is not the benchmark price, it's buyer behavior. Customers move to hand-to-mouth purchasing. You know what hand-to-mouth purchasing? Basically, you're just buying to get through another day, right? So fabricated slow orders, construction extrusion weakens, inventories rise, and freight insurance squeeze margins. Payment terms obviously become more sensitive. My way of framing this is basically below $90 Brent. Market is usually manageable. Roughly initial 95 to 110, you're going to start seeing stress and destocking, and essentially 120 to 130 sustained for a quarter. Asian slowdown risk becomes real. All right, and if physical crude is pushing towards 140 or 150, forget about it. Essentially, it's going to be the recession at this point. All right, so for recyclers, the signal is not just aluminum price, it's whether downstream demand starts stalling because of the benchmark rolls over. So what we're seeing right now is not classic deglobalization. It's more like rerouting and regional rewiring. So we have higher tariffs, sanctions, export controls, and compliance requirements are not eliminating trade. They're actually changing where production happens, where fabrication happens, and where material gets consumed, right? China remains the production base in many categories. ASEAN increasingly becomes the assembly platform, right? India becomes more important in fabrication and final demand, and that creates more Asia to Asia trade and more localized scrap flows. For exporters, that means the wrong destination choice of the wrong spec or the wrong paperwork can stop a cargo just as effectively as weak demand. Mm-hmm. So logistics still matter. Regulatory fragmentation now matters just as much. So the key thing I want to emphasize here is that this is not one metals market, right? Different metals respond differently to the same macro conditions. So ferrous and iron ore, they remain the most exposed to China property and steel margins, and that's still the weak link in the base case. Excuse me. Ferrous scrap is highly sensitive to EAF economics, the power costs, steel utilization, freight, import policy, and domestic mill pricing power. In the U.S., tariffs can indirectly support domestic scrap bids by lifting the finished price environment for mills. That does not mean tariffs mechanically set scrap prices, but scrap is still its own market, right? But it does mean that domestic buyers can gain more room to outbid export markets. Copper is a better leverage to grids, right? Manufacturing, EVs, and infrastructure. It's much less tied to property than ferrous, but structurally, it looks stronger. Aluminum is where the short-term and long-term China story really comes together. In the near term, China can push more exports if domestic demand remains soft and global prices stay elevated, which is happening right now. Actually, I do think there's going to be a large China export for aluminum. Over the longer term, China is also trying to differentiate through recycled and lower carbon aluminum as the carbon-linked trade rules become more important. Keep in mind, like when we're talking about demand drivers, one really big demand driver is going to be CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism for the EU, where you have to understand the embedded carbon and the carbon savings from essentially greener products. And China is really using that as a way to differentiate its products. So my base case is that copper and aluminum hold up better than iron ore, while scrap remains still keep the domestic scrap bid relatively firm. So what should exporters really be looking at right now? I actually want to go into this. There are 5 things I would actually watch constantly right now. First, China. All right. The property sales, local government infrastructure spending, manufacturing orders, export momentum, and in aluminum specifically, whether China starts leaning harder on exports. Second, in India, like CapEx, public CapEx, steel utilization, any safeguard or import policy move, and domestic industry lobbying. Third, energy, Brent crude. Basically, like, we can talk about Russian and Iranian discount spreads and essentially the refinery margins. Fourth, obviously, with shipping, we're looking at the Red Sea and Hormuz conditions, the freight rates, insurance costs, vessel rerouting, and delivery reliability. And fifth, obviously, the policy, the tariffs, export controls, carbon-linked trade measures, right? Destination-specific import requirements, and increasingly whether lower carbon material is beginning to command preference. So, and I would say that one more practical, metric for exporters is basically watch the domestic versus export scrap spread, right? If U.S. finished prices stay supported by tariff policy and mills keep bidding up the feedstock, exporters can lose tons even in a decent global market. My closing thought is this. Basically, a rising tide can still raise all ships, but only if material can clear the policy, logistics, and credit bottlenecks. For ReMA members, the winning export strategy today has to be regional, compliant, and flexible. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Please give all our speakers here another big round of applause for all the content that was That was a lot to take in, so I'm just going to ease for a second. I'm going to ask a very simple question. because I'm curious to know the answer. I'm going to ask all three of you, and I want as many from the audience to just shout out the answer. It's just one word, and it's going to be very easy. How is your ReMA 2026 experience so far in one word?
Amazing.
Amazing. That's great. Zulma?
Fabulous.
I like that too. Fabulous. And Stan?
Yes and yes. That's awesome.
We like all three. How about you guys? How is your ReMA 2026 experience so far? Fantastic. Good.
Sensational.
Tiring. There's coffee in the hallway and Coke and whatever you need. Okay, we have 2 mics, one on either side of the room. If anyone from the audience has any questions for our speakers, please come up to the mic, introduce yourself, and feel free to ask questions.
Good morning. Thanks again for your presentation. Presented on China. You're saying that China is a price setter, but the fact that they're closed to imports, how do they still influence the market? I'm curious about that.
Oh, could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
In your presentation, you said that China is a price setter. So the fact that they're close to imports, how do they still influence the market?
Close their markets.
Well, I can speak for ferrous. In the case of ferrous, how do they influence it? When it comes to the scrap import, the billet is a replacement for scrap. So we've had this, of course, the war in Iran. We also have, of course, which resulted in the fuel charges, resulted in freight costs, etc. So actually has been beneficial. What we have found is more people looking for scrap material, given the fact that billet is more expensive or not available within the market. So China is a large exporter for the Asian markets. Also, in the case of billet specifically, Iranian billet no longer became available. So that also gives scrap and ferrous scrap specifically an opportunity. And when it comes to paper, in the case of paper, given the fact that it is a large influencer as an export source, it does establish the pricing, the benchmark pricing mechanism to the buyer. And then from there, depending on whichever region we're discussing, it establishes that benchmark that we were talking about. Just their influence in the market, the volumes that they make available or take away from the market will move that pricing mechanism.
So look, China is still, it's still determined to remain the factory of the world, right? And in terms of it setting its price for looking at commodity or material demand, it's like, what is it producing and what is it shipping to the world, right? You have to look at it through that kind of lens. And what it's shipping the most to the world is let's go through it. It's essentially electric vehicles right now with a large underlying demand of aluminum, a large underlying demand of copper in every electric vehicle, as well as lithium. But we don't discuss lithium over here yet. And that material flow is basically, look, it's going to be producing those materials. It's going to be shipping it, as well as small consumer electronics, right? Essentially it is building up its capacity for those kinds of materials that look, U.S. policy, I think, has closed off a lot of markets, and China is definitely looking to fill those markets with its products. So when you're saying a market maker, yeah, absolutely. What does it need? Because what is it producing?
Along similar lines, how much of the scrap that's being exported, I'd use the word diverted to Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand. after processing, how much of that scrap or the finished winds up in China?
I would say almost all of it right now.
Okay. So is that how it kind of sets the market still too? Because it's buying the end product. I mean, it's buying all the scrap, but just in a more, furnace ready form or whatever.
Yeah, it's very interesting because basically after green sort, right? We had a yard in Qingyuan in China, and a lot of material flows in there. And when green sort kicked in, my uncles were like, "Oh, I guess we're done." Right? And in a sense, that was true. But all of the scrappers essentially set up yards in all of the other countries. All right. And they started making copper ingots, smelting it over there because basically you had the contamination rules that were set by green sword, but it still needed metal. You just process it. And I hate to say it, but basically and it comes down to the environmental externality, right? When you have a lot of waste, when you have a lot of refuse, that is a byproduct of scrap recycling. If you don't do it responsibly, well, they exported that externality. They still wanted the commodity. They just exported that environmental factor.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Shifting gears away from China for a second. We heard earlier during our presentations before I say this word, it's the regulations. I know we don't like using the W word in this room or in this part of the world. The EU waste shipment regulation or EU WSR. Several Asian countries have responded. We would know better in 2007. But in the interim, how would that impact material flows? Are the countries ready for the audit requirements? Are they prepared? And what are your thoughts on that? Could you tell from India perspective, and you can add on to the other countries?
So I'll start when there was the document which was submitted from European Union to our ministry, MOEF, Ministry of Environment Forest. We made sure that the document is replied in its full context. And MRAI was supporting the ministry with all the documents, all the data, what they required, why scrap is needed in the country. After this, I have been constantly in touch with Robin and my friend Arnold. One of the reasons I was talking to one of the secretaries in Ministry of External Affairs. We told them that, see, we need lots and lots of scrap, and EU WSR is coming and it will create a lot of hurdle not getting the scrap. He mentioned me one thing. Don't you think that you don't need aluminum scrap? I said, why? Our government has put a duty of 2.5% on aluminum scrap. And you people are saying that you need that material. First, you go and get this duty removed. So I would like to thank Arna for sending us a letter that aluminium being one of the most important commodities, the duty should go from 2.5% to 0. And that letter was submitted within PMO and Ministry of Mines and Ministry of Finance. To reply to your second question, when you say that, is India ready for EU WSR audits? I personally have visited most of the companies in India. Whatever materials is flowing from here to India, I'll say 90% material which end up in India ends up in units which are extremely compliant. Any audits, if there is no political agenda of EU that they don't want to ship that material at all, if there is only audit perspective, India will continue getting that material. But if there is some political agenda or some political thought process that this material should not go to India or any other part of the world, in that case, things will be different. But we are ready, audit-wise.
Thank you. From my brief survey, the Southeast Asia and East Asia will continue to be net importers. They definitely need the product. I don't feel that they are as formalized a process. Obviously, we're talking about main units and different entities as formalized as India and China itself. And even China is anticipated to have some issues when it comes to their reporting mechanism, as it just came out from the CBAM efforts, which obviously are finished steel. But when it comes to those efforts, it's to the legitimacy of those reports. I think that is going to be part of the discussion as to what type of audit system will be a double audit required for when it comes to honesty. It's really an effort, as ReMA has highlighted, it's really an effort to stop flows from the EU and retain the domestic material for domestic mills, in the case of ferrous. And the Vietnam, speaking with people in Vietnam, speaking with people in Korea, once again, it's stronger investments in trying to make efforts at increasing their domestic supply in order to shore up their needs and building relationships. And if EU will not they'll make great efforts at meeting the standards, but if for some reason that standard is not satisfactory to the EU, most of the buyers I have spoken with, whether it be from, like I said, South Korea or Vietnam or Thailand, they are making relationships elsewhere when it comes to sourcing. Material will come out and they will obtain it. And hopefully the restrictive nature of the EU will allow for more of a free trade.
Thank you.
Look, when we're talking about these EU regulations, I think the recycling industry, this is, when we're talking about a demand signal and a rising tide kind of situation, this is freaking fantastic, right? Look, this is essentially saying, I don't want primary metal. I want secondary. That's what it is. That's what it's signaling, right? A secondary market, essentially secondary metals market, there's going to be more demand for it because it has a lower carbon impact. If we're doing the right thing. Now it's actually the market saying, you know what? You're doing the right thing. There's actually going to be more demand for it. It's that simple. So it's really like, I think it's great for recyclers. It's great for scrappers. It's basically like throwing that audit trail to prove that essentially that sourcing, the traceability, the carbon savings. And that's really what the EU is looking for. And I think that is the general direction for the markets, to really start pricing in that kind of externality. Hey, you know what? If I'm sourcing something sustainably, well, it's better for the environment, but basically I should be compensated for it. And this kind of essentially CBAM is an attempt to essentially price that into the models, into the pricing models. I think this is fantastic.
Thank you all. Are there any licensing requirements or potential changes in documentation or changes in customs that the U.S. Exporters of recycled materials should be aware of or be prepared for in the coming year or so?
Nothing as of now in India. PSIC policies like that, it stands as it is. BIS standards were implemented for ferrous as per the ISD specs. Ferrous, non-ferrous standards were deferred, but maybe taken up in next 6 months or 1 year. Rest, I don't think any specific changes impacting the exporters of US origin.
Thank you.
The rest of Asia, we don't see anything extreme or additional. when it comes to traceability. The only thing is a more additional planning from a finished steel point of view when it comes to where will that material land. Scrap is already an advantageous position when it comes to the carbon definition. So, or recycled material. My apologies. But recycled material is already an advantage. But to the extent that it is an advantage, there's no additional requirements. Yet, if the finished steel for that mill is going to end up in the EU, there is additional planning that is going on already. And we've spoken to some mills that say, yes, we're planning for how to meet the requirement for the EU, how to standardize, but not necessarily for all our material.
Specifically at the U.S., essentially, let's call it a price discovery model. I think a lot of it has been priced in through the trade tariffs. Do I see an escalation? I don't know right now, but you never know with this current administration. And I understand why the administration is doing it, and people should think about it. It's about reshoring manufacturing capacity back to the United States. And this was a way to essentially protect domestic markets from this. Obviously, this has created, let's call it pricing floor, or basically a way for domestic mills to basically set elevated prices for international markets. Hey, there is still export demand, but now you have to basically, essentially, the landed cost of the metals is what's setting the floor, right? And it's up to Asian markets whether or not they want to pay for that. And is there enough underlying demand to justify paying that elevated price? So I think that's already been priced in, stay tuned.
Thank you, everyone. Are there any other questions from the floor? Very good. So they've been very informative. Thank you all again for coming here.
Thank you.